Hi.
Good to be here.
Great to have you, Nick. And you're right in the thick of it, because it's results day for you guys, isn't it?
It is, yep.
Anything going on?
Nope.
Nothing.
Wait and see.
Nothing to see here. It's a very chill, very chill. I should perhaps let you in a secret. I've known Nick for quite a few years through his life first as a writer and policy expert, then as a very successful politician in the UK, and now at Meta. It's a bit like the chrysalis that you saw earlier on the screen. There's just an evolution to Nick Clegg, but always, I think, in the business of giving clear answers to difficult questions. So, Nick, I mean, let's just ask that question. We spent quite a lot of time earlier on what is the metaverse, what's its potential. I'm not sure we absolutely can nail that, but please do give your own definition if you'd like to. And then let's segue that into what you see the big challenges being as someone who has your background on the sort of political, regulatory, and sort of ethics side.
So I think sort of stepping back, the biggest challenge will be that all the companies that are investing so much time and effort and blood and sweat and toil into building these AR and VR technologies, I think the danger is if left to their own devices, they will build a version of the metaverse which works for them, but is not necessarily going to work for users who want to move from one platform to another. I think one of the biggest dangers is that almost by accident we end up with a highly fragmented and balkanized metaverse where people will be on the ByteDance metaverse, the Microsoft metaverse, the Apple metaverse, the Meta metaverse, and everything we take for granted in the current internet, where you can move seamlessly. It's interoperable. I can send you an email from one email product to another. That doesn't translate to the metaverse. I think there's a sort of web of interoperable standards, rules, guardrails, understandings. Maybe some of them just can be worked out by the technologists themselves. Some of them might need regulatory intervention. But I think given there is just such a rush now for all these big players to build their own operating system and then their own worlds and then their own spaces upon which people can create their own experiences, I think the biggest sort of governance challenge is how do you make sure, for instance, the sort of safety rules that will prevail in Horizon Worlds will be consistent with the integrity and safety rules and the protections that you as a user have if you move to watch a concert or participate in a debate or just hang out and play table tennis with friends in another part of the metaverse hosted on someone else's platform and servers. I think that's in very sort of grand terms, since you asked me to start that way, that sort of, is it the centrifugal force? It is a centrifugal force, yes.
We're all trying to remember the difference between centrifugal and centripetal.
Yeah, can someone help me? I think centrifugal, yes, the one which, I think that centrifugal force, I think that's right, is the one to watch out for, because if you end up with a balkanized and fragmented metaverse, then we won't actually benefit from it in the way that I think everybody hopes this new computing, because that's what it is. It's not an app, it's not a piece of hardware, it's not a new experience, it's a new computing platform right from the foundations upwards. I think it'd be a great shame if that was as fragmented as it could become.
A guest just before you arrived, and it was putting it slightly differently, and thought that it was hence I was making the sort of point about the sort of chrysalis kind of development, that we may have a metaverse that goes through stages in which it does first sort of regionalize, and that to me also has some worrying political implications given the world that we're in, but that it would then go through that and open up again. It sounds to me like you would put it the other way around, that you have to aim for the most open metaverse from the get-go because there are risks in not doing so.
So I think there's a difference between what I was talking about, which is just the sort of the from a user point of view, it's a sort of seamless ability to move from one part of the metaverse to another, and to know that you have certain protections and rights and guardrails which will travel with you. Never mind, by the way, just the utility of being able to buy a digital product in one or service in one part of the metaverse and use it elsewhere. All of that requires an incredibly complex stack of different rules and so on. And I think what you're referring to, which is that particularly because access, not entirely, but will be heavily shaped by the ability to buy the new hardware, that in itself creates a certain sort of impediment to those who can't afford that, or just are not, or it's just not available to them in one market or another. And to that extent, of course, it's completely different to, in Meta's case, to our existing business, which anyone can use anywhere around the world as long as they've got an internet connection and a phone. But so anything that has a hardware component to it, and by definition, the hardware will evolve very quickly and will be more expensive at the beginning, and then when you get economies of scale, it'll get better. You know, in our case, we're not looking to make a great margin on the hardware itself. Our business model is entirely dependent on, in the long run, on commerce online in the metaverse, not the hardware itself. But of course, for people to really enjoy the full benefits of, and by the way, for those of you who haven't, do try the Quest Pro, our latest.
Nick will take you through it himself. He's got a load of time.
But I think there are available outside. And it is. Of course, although I say it myself, it is an extraordinary piece of technology and hardware. But that's a slightly different issue. I think you're completely right to say that when you have something which, in a sense, has a funnel, which is the expense and the availability of the hardware, that necessarily will accelerate more in more developed markets first. And we want to try and obviously make that as equitable and available as quickly as possible over time.
Let's come back to these three words here: open, safe, and accessible. And being as candid as you can be, I mean, how much do you think at the moment that is fulfilled? And I'll ask you to talk about Horizon Worlds first, because it's obviously, that's within the kind of Meta family. There have been some stories that safety is sort of still a tricky area, because once you put human beings with all their strengths and flaws and ups and downsides into kind of a different way of interacting with each other, you're going to replicate and in some cases magnify conduct and behaviours with potentially damaging outcomes. And just tell me a bit about your thought processes around that.
So I think of course you're right to say that any means by which human beings communicate with each other will mean that human beings say beautiful and wonderful and innocent things to each other, and also say bad and offensive and sometimes downright damaging things to each other. I think the question really is, does this technology require, or can you rather, apply the lessons that have been learned from particularly the sort of social media phase over the last decade and a half or so to how people communicate in the metaverse? My own view, for what it's worth, is that the differences are more instructive than the similarities. And the single biggest difference is that the communication that you and I would have in the metaverse, it's synchronous, it's ephemeral. It's much more like normal life. We'll say something to each other and then the words disappear. It's quite different to social media, where you post something, it develops a life of its own, it goes viral, it's there forever, and so on. So I think that in terms of the guardrails, which are clearly needed, you need to think about it more in terms of the analogy with the real world, and not with an analogy of existing social media. They're very, very different creatures. There isn't the same sort of permanence. And the other axis I would suggest is a way in which we need to think about this, as we're all trying to sort of grapple with these governance questions, is I think there'll be quite an important distinction between public spaces in the metaverse and private spaces. We just like in the real world. In the real world, you expect a high level of visibility and accountability and possibly scrutiny and surveillance for what you do and what other people do in the public town square. But if you're in your own living room and you're having a conversation with someone in the privacy of your own living room, you don't expect the police to be peering over your shoulder. And I think there is something analogous that will evolve in the metaverse. So in Horizon Worlds, in those public spaces, we have all sorts of codes and guardrails and rules and indeed, by the way, tools which mean that you can just block someone, you can abstract yourself completely, you can make yourself invisible, you can report someone. We have a rolling buffer, so the last few minutes of what you see is recorded on your headset, not on our servers, so that you can report that if you see anything untoward. But in those spaces, which I think will be one of the obvious uses that people will make of the metaverse, where you have, in effect, private, intimate spaces, I don't think they'd want the big companies that are constructing these worlds to be peering over their shoulder. And then there'll be a whole interesting question about whether you can report what goes on in those private spaces. And look, the more this can be done on a cross-industry basis, the better. Because there's no point, as I said earlier, for one entity to have one set of rules and another entity to have another set of rules. It'll be completely confusing to users, and it won't protect their interests. And that's why, whether it's the XR Association or whether it's the work that the World Economic Forum is doing or the Metaverse Standards Forum, all of which Meta is a member of, I think anything that brings these big players together to ask these foundational questions now, it will be really time well spent. So that, one final point for me, so that we avoid, if we can, this violent mood swing that we've had in the social media era, where the technology sort of erupted. It sort of erupted in scale around society, and then you had this frothy euphoria at the beginning that social media was going to be a solution to all our problems, the Arab Spring, everyone was going to be nice and lovely to each other. Now the pendulum swung completely the other way, and there isn't anything that is bad about the world which is not blamed on social media. And of course the truth, like ever, is somewhere between that excessive optimism, that excessive pessimism. I think we want to avoid that. We want to avoid this technology first, societal reaction later. The more we can anticipate those societal equities and problems and hardwire them into the governance frameworks applied to all the players in the metaverse space, the more I think it'll become more digestible, safe, and acceptable to society in the long run.
But how would you then convince competitors to go along with this? I see that argument for a framework, and you mentioned some sort of bodies and evolving forums who could be involved, but frankly there are sort of quite a lot of them, and joining them up is going to be very difficult. And if I'm a competitor, and we know, for instance, if you look at the sort of TikTok competition, it's a sort of hot topic at the moment. I was reading about alternatives to Meta in Asia, or the sort of idea of a sort of Asia metaverse, which will have its own competitive framework and challenges. What is the incentive there to come together around some sort of framework of rules, of norms that deliver on the open, safe and accessible, when I might just say, well, actually, I can just miss out a bit of this and get a competitive advantage, make life even more difficult on results day for Meta?
I think you can't. I think you can't. I mean, I think your implication of your question is it's not just going to happen through a sort of
because it's a good idea.
Through altruism.
Yeah.
It's going to happen, it's going to be driven in large part also by self-interest. I think there is a very powerful self-interest because you just won't get the economies of scale, you won't get the utility for users, you won't get the joy, you won't get the freedom, you won't get the innovation, you won't get the versatility that I think these metaverse technologies do offer unless people can interchangeably and interoperably move from one part of the metaverse in the other in a way which is loosely analogous to what we all take for granted in the current manifestation of our online and digital lives. I agree with you. It's perfect. It wouldn't be unsurprising if someone said, you know what, I'm going to try and lock someone in to my stack. And in a sense, and I don't want to sort of, I'm not saying this as acidly as it sounds, but there are very, very successful, very large companies, Apple's a notable one, which has developed fantastic businesses. We have a totally integrated vertical stack. You have the hardware, you have the services, you have the operating system and so on, and you inhabit that whole vertical sort of funnel. It works great for them. I just happen to believe, we strongly believe, in the long run, we will be shortchanging the value, commercial and otherwise, but also the societal and cultural value of these metaverse technologies if we don't now try and build them not as this sort of closed vertical stack of operating system, services, apps, hardware and so on, but you make them much more open and interoperable. I think there is a very powerful commercial self-interest in doing that. So look, for instance, I mentioned one of the forums, the WEF has this, I think it's called the Metaverse Governance Forum. I sit on that. I'm on the advisory group. So does Brad Smith from Microsoft. So does Kent Waterker from Google. So do others. I just think if you can try and get a critical mass of players who understand that everyone has a self-interest in trying to work out these rules together. And look, it's the other thing I'd...
So are you proposing kind of WTO for the metaverse?
No, not WTO, just a critical mass, just momentum towards more openness and against a highly fragmented, balkanized experience. I just don't think it will take off. I just don't think people over time will use it. So I think we all have as I said, it's not altruism, it is self-interest, which is always a good motivation for companies. And I think it should, and I hope will work in this endeavor as well.
This capitalism thing, it could still catch on. You talked about privacy, and I was really interested in that, having tried my first metaverse experience, and it just set me thinking about that strange sense that you have. And I asked the audience early, and there's been a bit of in and out, but how many people have actually had the experience or are going to have it today, or just any experience with the headset? So a few early, yeah. There's someone waving there. Yes, she had a great experience. It's one of our panelists from just now. But there is a sort of disorientation. There's a little bit of, oh, right, so how personal would I be in this? And then I guess what happens is people just get used to it in the way that we used to worry about, getting on a call together, or maybe having sort of more personal conversations that we would now do on the flat screen. But that did set me thinking about the potential for hacking, and it did you said you can obviously control to an extent what you do yourself, and if somebody's doing something you're not happy with, you can absent yourself. But it does seem both a technical question but also a kind of risk profile question of how worried you would be about metaverse hacking.
What do you mean by metaverse hacking?
I mean, people getting into what you're doing sort of in a more, using metaverse in a more personal way. When you sort of said, if it can be like being in your living room, I'm crunching down what you said, that it's rather different, you said, from social media that way, because it has a life of its own and all those things which have turned out sometimes to have a big downside. I suppose I was just channeling a bit of techno-pessimism here and saying, well, do you think is a guarantee to go that way? Because where there is potential to hacking takes place. Yeah,
I'm sure people will continue to try and hack people's accounts, their financial details, and so on. And I think that is an issue which the whole industry will have to deal with. I think the advances in the protection of people's data, financial data, personal data, sensitive data has come on in leaps and bounds in recent years, but it's a highly adversarial space, and clearly that'll play itself out. Look, but there, and I think this is sort of adjacent to, but it's relevant to your question. There is always a trade-off between complete privacy and complete safety. And I think we just need to be open about that. If you want to make people completely sovereign and private, then you will not be able to deploy the monitoring techniques that are necessary to keep systems completely safe. So you just have to be quite open with people about the trade-offs. You have to be quite open about the fact that it's one of the reasons why I think interoperability will be so important from an integrity and safety point of view, because bad people, bad actors trying to do nefarious things are not going to do it just in one part of the metaverse. They're going to try and develop their own, if you like, network effects across the metaverse, and that's why you need to have protocols and standards and possibly data sharing, which operates across the metaverse. But of course, the more you share data, the more you're having to ask people that their data is not entirely under their own lock and key. And I just think we need to be open about those trade-offs. I think a lot of those trade-offs in the long run should and can only really be made through the democratic political process, because it's only in the end, I think, society needs to decide in the end what is the balance between complete privacy and complete safety. But we have that in our everyday lives as well. You could make society completely safe by imposing a curfew on everybody, and people can't go out forever. You curtail freedom, you guarantee greater safety. That's an ancient dilemma that we all debate in democratic
debated every Friday night with 3 teenagers.
Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly.
You can guess who's winning that one.
Exactly.
We don't even need to go to...
I think there are, as long as one is candid about the fact that there are trade-offs, and that you give users very explicit control over their own experience, but also understanding that for their own data to be kept safe, whether it's from hackers or from menacing behavior from others, you would expect those who are running their services or those who are hosting those experiences on their platforms would therefore have certain insight into data and what their experiences are. As long as one is open about that and has we have a mature industry-wide discussion, I hope we can strike the right balance.
Well, just in our last few minutes, I thought we might just go a little broader because we've talked this morning about use cases, we've talked about potential for businesses, we've talked about what that would mean in terms of how businesses would change their strategy with the awareness of a metaverse, either by directly already sort of investing in product and development, or just also thinking about where they want to go. And I don't just mean businesses, by the way, I mean providers, their healthcare, health services, these could be national, regional services, or anyone who's really in the business of any form of communication or selling something. And I'm just going to read you a challenge. And this is from obviously it's not from The Economist, as it happens, I should say, but I thought it was a useful challenge. There's an obvious problem with the vision of metaverse who wants to wear a clunky virtual reality headset, and that basically adaptation might be much slower than perhaps we have reflected this morning. Now, 2 possible ways to answer that. It then goes on about, well, there's not so many people using it, and you feel a bit dizzy after and all that. That you'll have heard. One, it reminds you a little bit of someone saying the internet will never catch on. It has a slight element of that. But 2, what if it's right? And what would your answer be to someone who just said, this headset thing it's based on a sort of access point that you either have to come to accept, or you just won't use it as much as you need to do?
I mean, look. There was I forget who it was. There was someone may have said this who was in this room now. There was a VR entrepreneur I read the other day who said, it's like trying to land on the moon all over again, and people are complaining that the coffee machine doesn't work. Of course, there are going to be things which don't work. Of course, there are going to be false starts. Yeah. Of course, there are going to be some products that are going to take off more, and others that won't. Some headsets which will feel much better to people, and you'll be surprised on the upside, surprised on the downside. This is not a linear line. No one's completely sure of exactly how these things are going to unfold. We're in the foothills of this journey, and I just kind of it also slightly depends on your demeanor. If you're in the foothills of a journey, there are some people who are of a more pessimistic or cynical disposition, who, dare I say it, are often quite well represented in your vocation in journalism, who will point out all the reasons why something's never ever going to come about. Right. And then you have sort of flight of fancy idealists, many of whom often hang out in Silicon Valley, who think that everyone's going to be brilliant. I mean, it's going to be sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There are no guarantees, but it doesn't seem to me to be at all implausible to believe that if you look at the way we've moved from clunky desktops to laptops, and now we all spend our whole life with something clutched in the palm of our hand, that there isn't a sort of law of nature that says that's the end of evolution, and it's just phones. We believe that something that you put on the bridge of your nose, which is light and comfortable, and of course will be much less heavy and all-enveloping than the early models that we've used. And if you look at, for those who, it sounds like a sales pitch, but it's just genuinely interesting. For those
Surely not.
Well, hang on a bit. For those who've used Quest 2, which is quite heavy and protrudes here, try Quest Pro for one simple reason. We put the battery at the back, and it's open under your lenses here, so you don't feel, you're not completely shut off. It's quite a different experience. In my view, it feels much more natural because it feels much more like wearing spectacles. That is what we think, and not just us. By the way, the metaverse will be built regardless of whether Meta exists or not. I know there are some people who don't want Meta to exist, but the metaverse is not going to be built by one company. Thank heavens it's not going to be dominated or governed or run by any one company. But the bet that we're going to move beyond phones to something else, and that there are the optics and the hologram technologies which eventually will allow you and I to have this conversation where you could be thousands of miles away in London, but I could be sitting next to you and we could literally feel, as I already feel, when I have my weekly meetings, as I've had for months with my team every week in Horizon workrooms, I literally feel I'm breathing the same air. By the way, it's not even so much because of the visual experience of these slightly sort of cartoony avatars. The audio technology is extraordinary. You literally feel as if you are sharing the same space. Now, is there any guarantee that that technology is going to be as brilliant as the proselytizers think? No, there's no guarantee, but it stands a pretty good chance when you have all of this effort, all of this money going into this landmark technology. I think it's already advanced much further, more quickly than I expected. Is there then a time lag before it becomes adopted on a mass? Of course there is. And during that time lag, do lots of people pop up and say, oh, look, you know, all this hype, I never believed it anyway? Yes, of course. That always happens. It's always happened with every technological change. Can I guarantee you that I think, as before, that cynicism will be confounded by reality? That's what I think. That's what I think. I can't guarantee it, but that's what I think. And certainly when my use of the technology suggests to me it's not where it needs to be eventually. But boy, I think the early steps have been promising.
And if I just, as a concluding thought, we said open, safe, and accessible. You said earlier, and I thought it's a really eternal trade-off. You know, it's a philosophical trade-off, really, between openness and safety. Have we got the mix right, or are we beginning to get that mix right, or the proportions in this, you know, this sort of cocktail, which is very important as it would apply to metaverse?
No, look, there's so much research we need to do. So you know, we have, and I think there are some partners in the room who are participating in our XR research fund. I think it's around $50 million, where we're doing a whole bunch of research on, you know, for instance, we are one of the founding partners of the Digital Wellness Lab at the Boston Children's Hospital, to understand the effects on children's brains and social development of not just of the metaverse and not just of our products, but of entertainment products more generally. There's so much research that we need to do, and then you need to make sure that you have fora such as the XR Association, where all the industry partners can look at this research and talk to regulators and have a thoughtful and logical discussion about where the guardrails should be, what the trade-offs are. I hope, and certainly something I devote a lot of my time to, I hope if we front load those questions now, don't pretend we have all of the answers, but ask them in the right order, that will then avoid, as I say, this great mood swing from optimism and pessimism, which has distinguished a lot of societal attitudes towards other communication technologies over the last 15 years.
Nick Clegg, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it a lot.